Thank you, Nana and Yuta, for your wonderful remarks. I think it's clear that JASC 73 is in great hands, and I look forward to seeing what you guys can accomplish in the future. Now, we will transition into our keynote speech for the night. I do want to remind everyone that there will be a brief Q&A session after the remarks. If you wish to ask a question to our speaker, please do send a private message to me through the Zoom chat, and I will then call on people in the order that they messaged me once we reach the Q&A session. So now, without further ado, let me introduce our keynote speaker, Secretary Norman Mineta. During his long career in public service, Secretary Mineta has achieved a wide array of accomplishments surrounding economic development, science and technology policy, foreign and domestic trade, and civil rights. Secretary Mineta began his career as a representative of San Jose, California, first on the city council and then as mayor before being elected to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives. Once arriving in Washington in 1975, Secretary Mineta remained on California's congressional delegation for 20 years. During his tenure, he co-founded the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus and was chair of the National Civil Aviation Review Commission. His time in Congress culminated in his ascension to the chair of the House Transportation Committee, a position he held from 1993 to 1995. Just a few years later, in 2000, Secretary Mineta was appointed the Secretary of Commerce by then-President Bill Clinton. Then with the transition to the George W. Bush administration in January 2001, Secretary Mineta was again appointed to a cabinet position. This time, he was made Secretary of Transportation, a position he held for over 5 years. Following the attacks of 9/11-2001, Secretary Mineta guided the creation of the Transportation Security Administration, or TSA, which was the largest mobilization of a new federal agency since World War II. Throughout his career, Secretary Mineta has been awarded numerous awards, including the Wright Brothers Memorial Trophy for significant public service with enduring value to aviation in the United States, the Tony Jannus Award, and the highest civilian honor in the United States, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. We are honored to have Secretary Mineta join us here today, and on behalf of the Japan America Student Conference, I would like to extend him our thanks for taking the time to come and speak with us as we close our 72nd conference. Now, please join me in welcoming Secretary Norman Mineta.
Well, Chris, thank you very much for that wonderful invitation or introduction. And I've got to admit, I am so proudful tonight to be a part of this program. And I want to thank Linda Butcher for having extended this wonderful invitation to speak to the U.S. and to Japanese students. My parents came from Mishima, Japan, which is in Shizuoka Prefecture. And that's about, I guess, an hour and a half or so out of Tokyo by the Shinkansen, the bullet train. So it really gives me great pride in being able to share in today's program. To give a little background, my father came to the United States in 1902, and he was 14 years old, came by himself, not knowing the language. He had an uncle who was working for Spreckels Sugar Company in Spreckels or Salinas, California, which is about 120 miles south of San Francisco. And as he said, he didn't know that much about US geography, and he got off the ship in Seattle, Washington, rather than San Francisco. So here he was 14 years old, not knowing any English. And then he worked from one lumber camp to another farm labor camp. Took him a year and a half to go from Seattle to Salinas. And when he got to Salinas, his uncle said, "You've got to learn English." So he put him in the first grade. And he said it was the most humiliating thing he ever did. Not so much because he didn't know English, but he was about 5'2" or 5'3". So there were some kids in that school who were taller than he was. So it gave him great incentive to want to learn English. So by the end of second grade, he decided to graduate himself from the second grade. And by that time he was 17. So Speckle Sugar gave him a job. This whole issue of trying to further the relationship and understanding by more and more young people, and in the specifics, the ability of the US students and the Japanese students to get to learn more about each other's country is an important facet of expanding the knowledge for everybody. And so the whole issue of trying to do this through different means, especially like this conference, is very important, because as all of you will recognize, education is so important. And as an aside, let me say that all of you as young people own two things that no one else owns. One is your name, and the second is your integrity. And I want all of you to do everything in your power to make sure that you protect both your name and your integrity. Because without integrity, you will not be able to get the respect of others about your capabilities or what your future might hold for you. So please, as you look at your long-term, short-term, mid-term goals, always make sure that you protect your name and integrity. Keep your eye on that long-term goal, but make sure that you don't stumble on anything that might be right in front of you. So please don't take any shortcuts. People say, oh, well, they'll never know about this. Oh, yes. At some point in your life, something that you may have done and you thought you would be able to hide from somebody will reappear. And it won't be a pleasant experience. So please do everything you can to protect your name and your integrity, and you will then have a very fulfilling professional or public service career. So I'm thrilled again and honored to be part of this US-Japan conference. Now, the whole issue of education is important because it gives you the basic foundation for your vocational or professional goals. So I know in my case, my father was eventually ended up starting in 1920 in the life insurance business. So when I was in high school, he said to me, I want you to join our insurance business after you go to college. And I said, no, Papa, I want to become an aeronautical engineer. So I graduated high school, went to the University of California at Berkeley with the intention of becoming an aeronautical engineer. That is, until I took calculus. And at that point, I decided for my own career, and especially for the safety of the country, I should find something else to do. And so I thought, okay, I'll follow my father and go into the School of Business Administration. But at that time, the School of Business Administration at Berkeley was only for third year and fourth year students. So that meant the first 2 years, you had to take some other major in order to get your associate arts degree before going into your upper division work. So I chose economics. Then I found out that at Berkeley, economics was all math again. And then I thought, oh my gosh, at this rate, I'll not even see my Associate of Arts degree. But I struggled with it and got my AA and got into the School of Business at Berkeley and graduated. And on graduation, I was an ROTC student taking reserve officer training for the US Army. So when I graduated, the Korean War was going on, and I went straight on active duty and served in Korea and Japan. And in January of 1954, was transferred to Camp Zama and in Sagamihara Prefecture as a detachment commander of the Military Intelligence Detachment at the headquarters. It was a joint headquarters of Army Forces Far East and 8th U.S. Army. So again, it was interesting because when we were growing up, we spoke Japanese at home. And of course, going to school, we learned English. So when I got to Japan in 1954 and visited my relatives, and I spoke Japanese, and they would start giggling. And I'd say, well, you know, I know I speak very poor Japanese. And they said, no, we haven't heard that kind of Japanese in a number of years because words have changed. Well, I had learned the Japanese that my dad and mother brought when they came. My dad came in 1902 and my mother in 1914. So they brought the early Meiji period language of the early part of the century. And so people they said, we haven't used that language in 30 years. So words had changed. And so they even chuckled at the Japanese that I was speaking at that time. And and then of course, my Japanese today is even much worse because I don't even have a chance to use it at all. So it's embarrassing for me to even use what little Japanese I knew at one point. But education is so important because it gives you the ability to, even though you may major in a specific area, go into that field and pursue your professional and career goals in that area, but you don't know when opportunities will come up. And so that, as in my case, I was in the insurance business, but in 1967, there was a vacancy on the San Jose City Council, and the newly elected mayor and two members of the incumbent members of the city council came to me and said, "We want you to submit your name for an interview by the city council because we're going to fill that vacancy." Excuse me, by appointment. And so I said, well, you know, I'm in business with my father, so let me talk to him first about doing that. And so when I spoke to him, he said, well, you know, you and I can discuss how we can manage the business, and we can do that in any which way. But in Japan, there's an old adage that if you're in politics, you're going to be like that nail sticking out of that board. And you know what happens to that nail? It gets hammered. And the question is, can you stand being hammered by your friends, your neighbors, your constituents, by whomever? So I said, well, I'm still going to be able to stay active in the insurance business and still serve on the city council. And so I said, I'd like to maybe apply. So I did, and there were 13 other candidates who applied. And so I got interviewed by the city council and was appointed to fill that vacancy in 1967. So again, you will find that even though you have prepared yourself for a career or professional goal, there will be opportunities for you to branch out or to try a new endeavor. And so that's why keeping a good name, keeping your integrity intact is so important, because you never know when these kinds of opportunities will arise. And in terms of our US-Japan relationship, for the United States, our future in the Asia area is the US is so dependent on a good relationship between the United States and Japan. And whatever else happens in the Asian area, it will very strongly depend on that strong US-Japan relationship. And we've had, going back, let's say, to the longest term prime minister who existed at one point before Prime Minister Abe, who served the longest. But that relationship is so important to the United States that we're always looking for people to further advance that strong US-Japan relationship. And so when you mention that next year's conference is going to be held where the tragedy of the nuclear plant explosion took place, and in that prefecture or near it. And so I know that it's a safe area to go to now in terms of where you're going for your conference. But what's more important is that it's in a site where, or in a country where we are trying to build that long-term, further the long-term solid relationship between the United States and Japan, and the ongoing relationship now with the new Prime Minister Suga is again primary to that growing relationship. So again, we look forward to many of you participating in the future. If you're, let's say, typically people in the Gaimusho, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, come from either Todai or Kyodai. And I always have to laugh about how the Japanese put so much emphasis on what university you went to. And so like University of Tokyo, it gets shortened to Todai for Tokyo Daingaku. Or if it's University of Kyodai, it would be Kyodai. Well, I always joke and say that I also am what they say in Japanese is Rakudai, which means flunking out. So it's a play on words between what the Japanese do and what that play on word translate to in Japanese. So again, as we further these relationships, it is important that this foundation of the U.S.-Japan relation continues to be strengthened. And there are many exchange programs. So if any of you have opportunities to be part of an exchange program, to come to the United States as an intern or as a young academic or young business person, please take advantage of those opportunities that come up so that you can learn more and more about us as we learn more and more about you. So again, Chris, maybe at this point, I can open it up to open it up to questions so that I can be more responsive to what their interests might be.
Certainly. Thank you so much for the keynote speech, and I will now open up the floor to questions. And I believe the first one comes from Mr. Robert DeVico. Please feel free to ask your question to Secretary Mineta.
Hi, Mr. Mineta. I'm an alumnus from Japan America Student Conference's sister program, the Korea America Student Conference. Thank you so much for your valued keynote speech. My question for you is, in February of this year, the California Assembly issued an apology for the state's role in Japanese internment during World War II. And so I was wondering, what did it feel like to hear an acknowledgement from the state in this way? Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Life for me living in San Jose, California prior to World War II was a pretty comfortable life. And we lived near our Japantown in San Jose. But our neighborhood was integrated. We had young Italian Americans, German Americans, Mexican Americans. And so life went along pretty well until December 7th, 1941. We had just returned home from church about 12:15 that afternoon on the 7th of December. And my mother loved to listen to music. So we were at home listening to music, and then we got this announcement. We interrupt this program to bring you this news bulletin, and it was about Japan attacking Pearl Harbor. And soon after that, people started calling my father or dropping by our home to talk to him about what the impact of that attack on Pearl Harbor would be on those of Japanese ancestry. Now, as an immigrant from Japan, he could not own land because Washington, Oregon, California had what was known as the Alien Land Law. And the Alien Land Law said that if you are not eligible to become a US citizen, you could never own land. And so he, being an immigrant from Japan, and under the 1924, what was then called the Oriental Exclusion Act, always prevented Asians from becoming US citizens. And the first to be taken out from under that restriction were the Chinese, because they had worked cooperatively as an ally during World War II. And then secondly, in 1946, at the end of the war, the US Congress decided to extend to Filipino the ability to become US citizens because of the valor of the Filipino scouts during World War II. And then 8 months later, Congress again rescinded that law and kept the Filipinos from becoming citizens. So the Chinese were the only ones to ever be excused from any of the restrictions of the Oriental Exclusion Act of 1924. So when the war started, and President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 on February 19th, 1942, extending the ability of the then Department of War to evacuate and intern persons. It didn't say Germans, it didn't say Japanese, it didn't say Italian, it just said persons. And so as a result of that executive order, placards were being nailed to utility poles and to the sides of buildings, and big placards, and it said, "Attention, all those of Japanese ancestry, alien and non-alien." Well, I was a 10-year-old and saw these signs being put up, and I looked at it and I thought, what's a non-alien? So I asked my brother, who's 9 years older, and he said, "That's you." I said, "That's not me. I'm a citizen of the United States." He said, "Well, no, they must be starting some kind of propaganda program, and so we're being called non-aliens." And so that's why to this day, and 2 days ago, I celebrated my 89th birthday. And so to this day, I take pride in the word citizen, because my own government wasn't willing to acknowledge me. The United States government was now willing to acknowledge me as a citizen. They referred to me, us, 120,000 of us, as non-aliens. So I don't know when the last time any of all of you as Americans stood on a chair, beat your chest, and said, I'm a proud non-alien of the United States of America. And I don't think you have. So again, the 7th of December, without a doubt, was a major seminal turning point for the lives of those Japanese and Japanese Americans who were living in the United States. So after this Executive Order 9066 was signed into law, the commanding general of the Western Civil Defense Command that covered Washington, Oregon, California, who, again, recognizing that Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor, felt that the Japanese could attack the west coast of the United States. And if Japan attacked the west coast of the United States, this commanding general, who coined the phrase, once a JAP, always a JAP, commandeered racetracks and county fairgrounds, not all of them, but certain ones, to start the program of evacuating and interning people of Japanese ancestry into these commandeered racetracks and fairgrounds because they had built-in living quarters, namely the horse stables. And so soon after the 19th of February, as these placards were being put up on utility poles and sides of buildings, everyone was being notified as to when they would be forcibly removed from their homes and incarcerated for the duration of World War II. And I only saw my dad cry on 3 occasions. The first was on 7th December, because he couldn't really understand why the land of his birth was now attacking the land of his heart. He had come to really love the United States of America. And so even as an immigrant from Japan, he wanted to do something to help in the war effort. And so while we were in camp, and that was Heart Mountain, Wyoming, he applied to the University of Chicago for a position in the Army Specialized Training Program that was at the University of Chicago, teaching Japanese to US Army personnel. And so he was accepted for that program and left camp to go to Chicago. And when he asked for permission for my mother and me to leave, the Army said, no, they can't leave, but you can. So he went off by himself out to Chicago and then served as a Japanese instructor under the Army Specialized Training Program. So that internment and incarceration of those of Japanese ancestry is very little known by the rest of the public. But in 1970, at the National Convention of the Japanese American Citizens League, they passed a one-sentence resolution to, quote, undertake the legislative program to seek an apology from the government of the United States and to seek redress payments of $25,000 per person. And so the officers and the professional staff of the National Japanese American Citizens League came to visit the four members of the House and Senate who were of Japanese ancestry. And that was Senator Dan Inoue from Hawaii, Senator Spark Matsunaga of Hawaii, Congressman Bob Matsui of Sacramento, California, and me from San Jose, California. And as we were listening to the staff and officers of the National Japanese American Citizens League, Senator Inoue said, you know, this is really something that's going to be near impossible to do because very few people know about the evacuation and internment of those of Japanese ancestry. We're going to have a commission like the Warren Commission on the study of the Kennedy assassination. And he said that report came out and it became a bestseller. It was on news every day. And so we've got to have a commission to find out what motivated the United States to do this in 1942. And so Senator Spark Matsunaga said he had a legislation to investigate or to attempt to pass legislation to start a claims program for Native Hawaiians. And I had a very brilliant, young, wonderful legislative director by the name of Glenn Roberts. And Glenn took Senator Spark Matsunaga's legislation and then transformed that into what became the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. And they studied the issue for 2 years and came to the conclusion that the evacuation and incarceration was a result of one, historically racial prejudice, secondly, wartime hysteria, and third, the failure of political leadership in 1942. And so all of a sudden, we're being evacuated, forcibly removed from our homes and put into camps for the duration of World War II. So I'm sorry, Robert, to go so long about the evacuation, but that essentially was what happened. And then in 1987, or 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which then issued or called for the issuance of a national apology by the Congress of the United States and payment of $20,000 in redress to all of the people who had been evacuated and interned during World War II. So let's go on to the next question, Chris.
All right, absolutely. Our next question comes from Ms. Katsura Pennington. Please go ahead.
Hi. So Mr. Mineta, you're one of the few people to have served as a member of cabinet under two presidents from different political parties. So I wanted to ask, what was that like, and what do you have to say about current polarization in American politics?
Well, such a timely question. And the whole issue of, well, first of all, when I became Secretary of Commerce, it was for President Clinton. It was for a very short period of time because Secretary of Commerce Bill Daley was leaving to go run the Gore campaign. So I was only Secretary of Commerce from June of 2000 to 20th of January. So then I would be out of a job at the end of that term. And it was sort of funny because on December 29th, Friday, at about 10:30 in the morning, our son was a pilot with Delta Airlines, and he lived with us at home. And he said that President-elect Bush is talking about putting a Democrat in the cabinet, and he hasn't done so. And I see the job as Secretary of Transportation is still unfulfilled. Any chance he would be calling you about filling that job for President Bush? And I said, Bob, what have you been smoking or drinking? I said, that's a near impossibility. Now that was 10:30 in the morning. 1 o'clock, the phone rang, and he, living at home with us, picked up the phone and he said, yes, sir. Yes, sir, he's standing right here. Yes, sir. So he cups the phone, hands it to me and said, it's the vice president. So I picked up the phone and I said, Al, and the fellow said, no, Norm, this is Dick Cheney. I said, oh, Dick, I'm sorry. And he said, no, that's all right. He said, but I am calling to ask whether or not you would consider coming on board as the new Secretary of Transportation in our administration. I said, Dick, you've got to be kidding. He said, no, we've given this a lot of thought and we want you to come on board as the Secretary of Transportation. And I said to him at the time, Dick, I don't want to be marginalized as the only Democrat in the president's cabinet. And on the other hand, I don't want to be considered a turncoat by the Democrats. Now that was on a Friday. So that Saturday and Sunday, I spoke to over 100 people seeking their opinion about whether or not I should consider doing this, including about, I think it was 34 of the 37 members of the Congressional Black Caucus. And they all, because I didn't want them pulling the rug out from under me if I took the job. And they all said, no, take the job. And so I had a talk with the incoming new Chief of Staff, Andy Card, for President-elect Bush. And Andy was the Secretary of Transportation under President George H.W. Bush. And I was the chair of the House Committee on Public Works and Transportation and worked with him very closely on a number of issues, including help ending the railroad strike in 92, 93. And so in any event, President Clinton says, when I talked to him, said, my inclination is you ought to take this job. And then when I talked to Vice President Gore, he said, Norm, I want to encourage you to take the job because you could be very helpful in the healing process. He said, I didn't like the Supreme Court decision. I'm still chafing from that whole experience, and you would be very helpful in the healing process if you took this job. So I did. And it was unfortunate that the press kept thinking of President Bush as a doofus, as someone who really wasn't equipped to handle the job. But I found in working with him, I came to respect him and to love him for his job as a person. He was a warm, outgoing person, and I really enjoyed working with him. Stayed with him for 6 years as the Secretary of Transportation. And we went through a lot. I mean, we went through 9/11, we went through Katrina, the hurricane, Isabel, another hurricane, Rita, another hurricane. So we were hit with a lot of disasters in that 6 years that I was with President Bush, but we were able to handle it. I had an excellent, fortunate to have a very excellent staff, and so we were able to handle that very much during that time. Now today, the populace is so polarized that I think it's going to be very difficult to try to put Humpty Dumpty back together again as President-elect Biden comes into office. In the meantime, President Trump is probably going to have to be forced to vacate the White House. He's already indicated that he's not going to peacefully make that transfer, but we'll have to see. But it's unfortunate that we're going to be going through this, and he'll probably end up setting up a new network, probably with Sinclair Radio, to go after Fox News, to go after President Biden, and just be a thorn in the side for a long time to come to our great country. Thank you. Who is it? Katsuro-san, for your question.
All right, and we have one last question. We'll go very quickly on this one because we're running a little short on time. Last question from Gio Kamada. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mineta, for sparing your time. My name is Joe Kamata, and I'm one of the delegates for this conference. And so in the future, I'm aspiring. I want to be involved in the field of public service. And by doing so, I want to be an individual that will influence important decisions that would have an impact on the society as a whole. So my question is, based on your long experience in public service and in politics, what kind of qualities or requirements do you think are needed to become a public servant or a policymaker that can have a voice in important decision making?
Thank you, Joe, for your Gio-san, for your question. If you don't mind my characterizing it this way, I think people in public office need to have a bigger ear than mouth. People should really listen more intently to constituents, to just groups, whether they be in the private sector or the public sector, about their interests. And today, there's such a polarization, as you've indicated, that the word compromise is a dirty word. Now, there's nothing wrong with the word compromise, because through that process of give and take, you come to a conclusion to get something done. And it is more important to get something done through a negotiated process than this polarization and no communication between the majority and minority parties. And so we're stuck right now in this country with this whole non-polarization, or polarization rather, and the ability to try to get something done. And so I would hope that as you pursue your political and career goal, that you will keep that ability to listen to people and to try to find some common ground to come to a conclusion for the betterment of the populace. So Katsuro-san, really best wishes as you pursue your educational and professional goals in the future. Again, Chris, as you said, with time running out, let me again thank you and Linda Butcher and the whole International Student Association for this honor and privilege of being able to share a few thoughts with all of you. And again, please protect your name and your integrity as you continue through life. Best wishes to all of you. Stay in excellent health and stay safe during this shelter-in-place program. And again, best wishes and warmest regards to all of you.
Thank you, Secretary Mineta, for your kind words today. We were very honored to have you. Please, everyone, let's give him one last round of applause.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much.
Before you go, Secretary Mineta, would we be able to get one quick group photo with everyone? We're gonna try to take, oh wait, did we lose him?
No, I'm still here.
Oh, okay, sorry, it switched to me there. Sorry, it scared me. Can we take one quick group photo before we end?
Remind me, just as a curiosity, what time is it in Tokyo or in Japan?
It's currently please. It's 1 p.m. right now.
1 p.m.
Okay, so I'll be taking the photo. So I'll count in 3. So if you could pose for a second. So just a moment, please. In 3, 1, 2, 3, cheese. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, and with that, we will move on. And very quickly, I am going to pass it back to Yuta and Nana to say a quick couple of words before we do our final closing remarks.